Lila Bryson was convicted of raping 2 women before changing gender. She was initially taken to Scotland's only women's prison. Tiffany Scott, who stalked a 13-year-old when known as Andrew Burns, then also asked to go to the Corton Vale women's prison. There was public outcry about both of those cases. Now, the Scottish Government has paused the movement of transgender prisoners while there's an urgent review of all such cases. Rona Hotchkiss is the former head of HMP Corton Vale. She was the governor of the prison until 2017. She was due to talk to us this morning, but her answers have had to be voiced by a producer as Ms Hotchkiss has lost her voice with laryngitis.
When I was governor of Corton Vale around 2017, there was a suggestion that Tiffany Scott might be transferred to us. He was being held in a male prison and had been for some time. He was known to be extremely violent and very difficult to manage, posing an ongoing threat to staff and other prisoners. I was appalled at the thought of him being held with the women at Corton Vale. Many women in prison are among the most vulnerable people I've ever met, and this person would have terrified them. My immediate reaction was to say, "Over my dead body is he coming here?" Shortly after that, he was involved in some other incident and stayed at a male prison in segregation. The idea of moving him to Corton Vale wasn't raised again. In my view, informed by my experiences with other trans women I met in prison and the impact they had on the women around them, they should never be held in women's prisons. I think what needs to be understood is that, to all intents and purposes, trans women are indivisible from men. The argument goes that they are vulnerable in men's prisons, but there are groups of men whom that could also be said about, and they are held quite successfully in protection units within the male prison estate. No one would suggest, for example, that convicted police officers be held in a female prison.
The words there of Rona Hotchkiss. Well, we're joined now by Keith Brown MSP, Cabinet Minister, Cabinet Secretary for Justice in Scotland. Good morning.
Good morning.
You insisted last week that decisions on trans prisoners were for the Scottish Prison Service itself. What made you change your mind?
I also said I think there's an excellent track record in the prison service for dealing with situations where there are risks presented to prisoners, whether the prisoners themselves or prisoners that they are being accommodated with. However, we have seen a couple of very high-profile cases. There is, of course, emotive reaction and public concern. So in order to bolster that and to provide further reassurance, we have said that no transgender prisoner already in custody with any history of violence against women will be moved from the male to the female estate, and further that no newly convicted transgender prisoner with any history of violence against women will be placed in the female estate. This comes on top of the protections which are already there provided by the Scottish Prison Service.
These are just convictions for violence against women, clearly serious, but should it be broader to include violent offences of any kind?
Well, the issue that we've been discussing is in relation to trans women in particular, and just to make it very clear, this is not about trans women inherently presenting that risk. This is about predatory men who present the risk to women. But we also have said that there's a review. The Scottish Prison Service is conducting a review on lessons learned from these recent cases, which will report by this Friday, and that's against the backdrop of a longer-term review, just as the UK government has done, and it made an announcement to a similar effect last week as well. There'll be a longer-term review which will look at these associated issues.
Well, the approach due to be adopted in England and Wales is that transgender women with male genitalia or those who've been convicted of a sexual offence will no longer be held in women's prisons in all but most exceptional cases. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, I think what I've announced goes slightly further than that. It doesn't require the person to have male genitalia. It applies to, in this case, at this time, to all transgender women, transgender persons, in fact, in those two categories I've mentioned. And I think that is the right thing to do to provide that reassurance. I am relatively convinced these are the conclusions which the prison service would come to in any event. They have a tremendous track record in Scotland of protecting individuals, the general population and individuals.
Well, Rona Hotchkiss, who did obviously work for the Scottish Prison Service, senior there, former head of Corton Vale, and she's demanding an apology, actually. She's saying that you should issue an apology to women who've been telling the SNP government for years that trans women pose the same set of risks and threats to women as do any other group of men. No more, no less. Stop dismissing us as transphobes and bigots and start engaging with the issues honestly.
Well, I've not described anybody as a transphobe or a bigot in relation to this debate, and there are many prison governors that have a different point of view to Rona Hotchkiss, and that's quite legitimate. So I think the important thing just now is to concentrate on the public's concern, to provide that reassurance, and above that, to make sure that everybody is safe in prison. As it happened last week, I visited the Scottish Prison Service to hear about the way they protect individuals in relation to serious organised crime, a huge responsibility they have. They do this, protecting individuals in the prison system day in and day out, and they do an excellent job.
And so that could be done within the male estate?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
And so you're saying that could be done, that kind of protection of trans women could be done within the male estate?
I know that wherever
because clearly many of them would feel vulnerable as well.
Well, I know wherever people are placed, the Scottish Prison Service has got a tremendous track record of protecting them in that situation, and that is largely in part due to the multi-agency approach in terms of the assessment of where somebody goes. You know, whether it's health professionals, psychological assessments, they have a tremendous track record of making sure there's a process which has gone through to minimise risk to anybody in these circumstances.
Why do you think it reached the stage that someone who is convicted of raping 2 women was placed in a women's prison?
Well, of course, it's worth pointing out that being placed in Conton Vale, that's only in a segregated unit away from the general population. The interactions with the general population are not possible in that circumstance, and that's whilst the person is being assessed. I'd rather not talk about individuals, but it is the case that somebody would be being assessed at that point, and whilst that assessment's taking place, the protections would also be in place for the general population. Now, that's, I think, an important point which has not been brought out in the public debate. The way in which the priority is always the protection and the safety of prisoners.
Always the safety. Okay, so there are 11 trans women in Scottish prisons, 6 in male prisons, 5 in the female estate. Do any of those 5 have convictions for violence?
Well, this changes day by day, and as I understand it, none of those currently housed have convictions for sexual violence against women and girls. So, but that changes on a daily basis. And of course, in all that I've said, it's also true to say there is a caveat with that, which is that there can be exceptional circumstances, exactly the same as the ministers in England have said as well. And you have to do that because that is a legal requirement to do that.
Keith Brown, many thanks indeed for talking to us.